welcome back to my YouTube channel, and if you're new here then my name's Katie. I'm a full-time artist, and for the last year I've been doing a daily art challenge. I started my daily art challenge last August and I drew 6 days a week for 1 whole year, and here on YouTube I shared some recaps, so if you want to know more about every piece that I created I'll leave a link to the playlist down below. I also shared it over on Instagram daily, and I really wanted to share my experience with doing a daily art challenge. I found it a really interesting experience and it's one of the best things I've done, and I'll share a little bit more about that later, including all of the figures and numbers about how my audience has grown, but also why I found it so rewarding from a personal creative standpoint. I know a lot of artists who want to do a daily art challenge but don't really know where to start, so hopefully this video will help you. I'm going to share everything I've learned, including planning ahead, managing your expectations, and also sharing prompts and tips for how to stay motivated. So I'm going to jump right in with the first main point, which is why do a daily art challenge anyway? So a daily art challenge is obviously a big undertaking, and I know when I first started I had a lot of friends and family wonder why I was even doing this. So for me, I wanted to do it for a few reasons. Mostly I wanted to practice more. I found that I wasn't prioritising creating art, and I really wanted to make more and practice and really experiment with mediums and my style. To do that, I really needed the accountability, which is another thing that the Daily Art Challenge adds, especially on social media, because you are holding yourself accountable and putting it out there that you're going to do this every day, or however often you decide. One of the things I really struggled with is having a style. It's always been something that I've found difficult, and to try and find my style, it just meant I had to create more and more, and the more you practice, then the more you learn what you like. And I found my style by doing this daily art challenge. I also wanted to grow my community. I'm a full-time artist and I wanted to have a bigger platform to help enable my Patreon and my income streams. So I was very open at the beginning that I did want to grow my audience, and posting more regularly on Instagram really helped with that. But it also grew my community, so not only did I have a higher number, I also had a higher number of friends and people reaching out. And I really feel like I have an audience that feels more involved with my art, and it's become a really lovely place for me to hang out. I know that Instagram does get a bad rap, but I found a really lovely sense of community over there, and that was a really big win for doing the Daily Art Challenge. So next, I'm going to share with you my most important piece of advice, and I am going to put all of these headings down below in the timestamps if you want to skip ahead. So my biggest piece of advice is to make it manageable for you. I know some people do daily art challenges where they do it 7 days a week, but for me, I just needed that extra day grace, so I did 6 days a week. I also know people who have done 5 days a week, but it really depends on your schedule and making it work for your lifestyle. You don't want this to become a big stressor in your life, so try and make it so that it's something that you can fit in around your life and everything else that you do, because it can be a bit overwhelming at times. You can do every other day if that's easier for you, or you can create every day and not necessarily share on social media every day, because that's another thing you need to allow for, which is taking the photos and writing the captions. So it's not just creating the art, it's also sharing it. So if that's unmanageable for you, then really make sure it works for your schedule and maybe share every other day on Instagram or however it works best. You also don't have to do it for a whole year. 1 year is obviously a massive undertaking, so if you are just wanting to dip your toes in the water, then you could try doing a monthly art challenge similar to Inktober, where you create just for that full month, or you can do it every other month. It totally depends on what you think will work, and that's just my biggest piece of advice, is don't just copy what other people are doing and try and keep up, make it work for you. So my next piece of advice is to manage your expectations. Creating every day is a lot of work, let alone the pressure that we create for ourselves. I know for me, I put a lot of pressure on myself during the Daily Art Challenge to create really good art, and I found that to be quite unsustainable. And so the first 6 months or so I found really difficult to keep up with and find my momentum. So I changed things a little bit for the last half of the year to make it work for me and find my inspiration and motivation to help me carry on. So the most important thing is knowing that you don't have to create final finished pieces every single day. It's just impossible. You won't be able to keep it up and you'll burn out really quickly. So Managing your expectations is really important, and knowing that you can just create a thumbnail sketch for one day, you can do a page full of swatches if you're swatching some materials. That totally counts. Like, you don't have to spend hours and hours on your daily art. If you just have 5 minutes spare at the end of the day, then that totally counts. And I think a lot of it is just allowing our brains to accept that as being okay for daily art, and not comparing yourself to the artists you see on social media who only share final pieces every single day. If you are doing a daily art challenge, then be okay with sketches and quick doodles, because that still absolutely counts. I found this the hardest part because I, like I said, set very high expectations and pressure on myself, but once I allowed that in my brain and found a more of a routine and rhythm, which I'll also talk about later, I found it much easier to create. So my next point is planning it ahead. Now, this was something that I wanted to do from the beginning and actually didn't work out that way. But the plan was always to be one day ahead of sharing on Instagram, because that helped again to relieve the pressure of waking up and feeling like, oh my goodness, what am I going to create that day? It just meant I knew I had the previous day and I could carry on like that. But that actually didn't work out. I think I did that for maybe a handful of days throughout the whole year, just because I found that my inspiration ebbed and flowed, and the pressure did help me to just get on with it and create. And I was very rarely a day ahead when I was sharing. I really was just creating on that day and sharing it on that day. But it's a really good thing to try. If the pressure is a little bit scary for you, then I do recommend trying to be ahead. And it's also why my previous 2 points are so important, because the pressure does add up. My next point is what to do when things feel really tough and you want to give up. And obviously, if you are doing a longer challenge, there will be more and more days where you feel like this. I know I certainly had quite a few days where I questioned why I even started, and I just wanted to give it in. So the accountability does help with that, but it's also important to remember that you care more about this than anybody else. Social media is obviously saturated with a lot of artists, and people are following a lot of people. So don't be afraid if you can't create that day to just sack it off for that day and do it again tomorrow. Your mental health is more important than your art, so be sure to take a day off if you need it, and just post again the next day or when you want to. I know I skipped a couple of days where I didn't feel like I wanted to create, and I just needed a bit more mental space to recharge in between, rather than just having the one day off a week. And I found that during Christmas I needed an extra day just to get back to it. Nobody will mind or even notice if you miss a day, so be sure to factor that in. It really isn't the end of the world if you do skip one, but if it is happening more often, then it may be a good idea to reset the goalposts. If you're finding yourself getting too overwhelmed and skipping too many days because everything's mounting up, change the amount that you are creating. It's okay to change things further down the line. Just because at the beginning you said you'd create 7 days a week, it doesn't mean that you can't get a few months through, find that unmanageable and change them. You need to make this work for you if you want this to be a consistent practice, so it's totally okay if you then need to change it to 4 days a week, as long as it's manageable in your schedule. I know at the beginning of these things, it feels like you can do everything and you're really excited and inspired, but that does ebb and flow, and on the down days it feels harder. And if it does mount up, then definitely change those and make it work for you again. On very difficult and unmotivated days, I also had a few things that I found really helped for creating, and that was mostly to limit my options. The problem with these daily art challenges is that you can draw anything, anywhere, anyhow, and sometimes that's just too much of a choice, especially considering you have to create that day. So what I found was limiting my options really helped narrow things down. And I limited either my materials, my time, or the size of my art. A lot of the time I worked in sketchbooks rather than loose work, but working in the smaller 12x12 sketchbook was really useful for me because it felt less daunting and it's a much more manageable size. And similarly, if I gave myself a timer, which I massively advocate for, and I found that really, really useful for my daily art challenge, it feels a lot more manageable knowing that I've set aside 10 or 15 minutes for the daily art challenge rather than knowing I've got this whole afternoon but I need to create. By just setting aside that small amount of time made things feel a lot easier, and so timers really help with my daily art challenge and I do recommend them. You can also limit your materials, either by trying something new, which often helps add a bit more inspiration and motivation, but maybe by using a set limited colour palette, or maybe just like 3 pens and 2 pencils. Just limiting the options will really help and stop you from being too overwhelmed. I did find that knowing I could draw absolutely anything in the world was just a bit too much for me sometimes, and it was easier going into the day knowing what I was going to draw, and I'll share some places for references later on in the video, which should help. And again, if you are having a tough day, then it's a good one to revert back to managing your expectations and knowing that a quick doodle is totally okay to post if that's all you have time for. It's still being creative and you're still moving forward in the challenge. Like I mentioned before, there was a point where I felt like I wasn't improving and I totally got into a rut where I was just creating for the sake of it to post on Instagram. And at that point, I really needed to reconnect with my values and why I started this in the first place. I found that I was just creating more for Instagram, so it's really important to reconnect with why you are creating and what inspires you to pick up a pencil every day. I reconnected with what inspired me and what lights me up, whether that's a specific reference or a colour combination. I really had to zone in on and do a reset around Christmas time to try and re-inspire myself for the final 6 months of the challenge. It's really easy with social media to worry about what other people think and what your audience wants, but it's really important to reconnect with what you're doing, because I really do think that that comes through in the art. I can tell on those earlier pieces, but when I was feeling quite burnt out, that the inspiration wasn't behind it and I really wasn't feeling it. And then when I reconnected with it, I feel like it really showed in my work, and that's also when my audience started to grow, which I think does have a direct correlation. Another quick point to add here is that the algorithm and the audience on Instagram can be fickle, and it's really hard to know what someone will like. I actually found in most of my daily art challenge pieces where I didn't like the piece, my audience did, and it got way more likes than, say, some of my favourite pieces. So I definitely recommend creating what you want rather than worrying about what other people think, because it's just something that you don't have any control over. And talking about pieces that maybe you don't like and others do, that leads me on to my next point of creating work that you don't like but sharing it anyway. So I had a couple of comments asking about what happened when you created something that you really hate, but it's a daily art challenge and you don't really have time to create something else. And the question was whether you share it anyway or if you skip a day and just hide that away. And I understand the dilemma there, because daily art challenges can be used as like a portfolio, but I really recommend sharing the pieces you don't love anyway, because again, audience opinions are very subjective and what you hate could be what someone else really loves. It's also, because you are sharing it on a public social media platform, it's really helpful to get opinions. So although you might have written it off completely, sharing it online and opening up and being vulnerable about why you don't like it helps people come together and they really do support you. Instagram is a great place for community, and so they'll help you see the artwork in a different way. Maybe you're clouded by just putting it aside and really disliking it, but by putting it out there, someone can come in and say they really love your brush marks or your texture or the colour palette. And so seeing the different things that other people like help you to see it differently, and it's also where you can find the biggest amount of creative growth. I'm a strong believer in creating bad work, because even though you might not realise it at the time, that's where you'll learn further down the line, and I really feel like whatever work you create funnels into your final pieces. So I was starting to edit this video and I realised that my camera cut out. It did cut out on one of the most important parts, which was how I stayed motivated and consistent. So I'm here to record that bit again, because that's one of the main reasons I filmed this video. And then I'll be back to previous Katie to finish off the last few points. So I'm going to start with staying consistent first. And to do that, I definitely found a routine. During the first 6 months, it was more difficult because I hadn't found my rhythm and the routine of like photographing the artwork and finding out what my style was in those early days. And I did find it a lot easier in the last 6 months. So definitely something to bear in mind. If you are finding it tough at first, it definitely does get easier. I found that I got a good routine in creating the daily art in the morning, because that's when I felt most motivated to paint and create. Then I could take my photos, write my captions and hashtags, and then post for later in the afternoon. And that worked out really well for me and my schedule. So definitely finding a routine really helps because you do make it into a habit, and that's one of the reasons why I was able to stay consistent, was because it did become a habit after doing it for so long. I know that it's not always possible to create at the same time every day, so you do need to be a bit flexible, but if you have the same sort of steps, it really does help your brain to just know you're in work mode and to just get on with it. I also found it easier when I worked out how my photo setups worked. So if you look at my grid, you'll see that I do have like set backgrounds. So I either photograph on the wooden background, a white background, or I hold the sketchbook up in front of a plant or the bookshelves behind me. And that was really helpful for me because I didn't then have to worry about how to display the artwork. I could just cycle through these like backdrops depending on what I'd used last. And that definitely sped up the process for me as well. And I do recommend that if you are creating every day, you generally will find how you like to present your work, and you can just recycle those and your grid will still look really lovely. So onto the big one, which is how to stay motivated. And obviously some days will feel really easy, you'll feel like you can do this forever and you're really on top of it and you feel really inspired. And to balance that out, of course, you are going to have difficult days, but that is just the way that it goes, especially for a year-long project if you are doing it for that long. So as with most of these sort of things, just know that it will pass, and like the next day your inspiration might come back massively. And if it doesn't, then I do think it's a case of working through it. Even if you miss a day, don't give it all up just because you've missed that one day. Just jump back on and carry on. One of the best ways that I found I got motivated was to switch things up, and that's why I didn't have a prompt list, which I will talk a little bit more about in the next section. But I found it easier to be able to change things up, whether that's my materials, the time I drew for, the sketchbooks or loose paper that I did, or the size that I created. It was really helpful for me to work in multiple sketchbooks depending on what I felt like. I could change my mediums. If I bought some new materials, like I mentioned earlier, that would give me a boost of motivation because I can try something new. And just knowing that, although it can be a downside, like I mentioned earlier, knowing that I can create whatever I fancied meant I didn't feel really narrowed down into just doing, say, one subject for the rest of the daily art challenge. For me, as an artist, I found it much easier to know I could do whatever I wanted, depending on how I felt that day. I also found that it really helped if I knew what I was going to draw the night before. So if I could just find a reference picture, then I knew that I could go into the next day, and it was a lot easier than starting the day with nothing. If I just knew that I wanted to have this reference picture as my starting point, that really helped motivate me because it feels a little bit less daunting. I also find a lot of motivation from social media, so I really enjoy using Instagram and I follow a lot of my favourite artists on there, and I do find that always gives me a boost of motivation. I love to look at their feeds and see their sketchbooks, and their art style always really motivates me to carry on with mine and try to find my own art style and just to create and experiment more. So I know it is easy to fall into the comparison trap on social media, so there is a fine line, but for me I found it a really good way to get that little boost because I'll see someone's sketchbook and want to create in my own. So that does lead me on to the next point, which is all about themes and prompts and ideas. I was asked if I had a big prompt list for the whole year, and I'm definitely not that organised, but if you're more of a person who needs those prompts, then you can definitely have like a list that you can just pull from, especially on the more difficult days. I did take part in some prompt lists and challenges, but I didn't just solely do those. I kind of picked whenever I wanted to, or if you are stuck for ideas, they are a great resource to draw from. There's always something going on Instagram, and I do share those in my Patreon email newsletter, but it's a good place to go if you are looking for prompts and ideas for what to draw. I also found Patreon was really good for other artists for me to draw from. Again, I follow quite a few artists on there, and their drawing sessions really helped motivate me. The drawing sessions that they do are really helpful because you're basically just given what to draw. You're told to draw this reference for a set amount of time, and so it really takes away the brain power of having to draw and just doing what you're told. I found that really helpful for me creatively because I didn't have to think of everything, and so I do recommend finding some artists on Patreon and following their work there because that's another really big boost of motivation. I'm going to share my top 5 places for references now because these are the go-tos for me when I don't know what to draw. My first one are some copyright-free image sites such as Pexels and PicRepo.com. They have copyright-free images, and although it is good to credit the artist and you do have the information there, it is copyright-free, so it's not like you're using somebody else's photos without their permission. At the beginning I did find myself going straight to Pinterest, but I definitely avoid that now because I don't know the source, so I do go to these two sites for references now. If you followed my work for a long time, you'll know I love to draw landscapes, so my next suggestion is Google Maps or MapCrunch. MapCrunch is just a random generator for Google Maps, but I found it a really good way to just find somewhere in the world that I didn't have to choose and it gave for me, and I could just draw the view there. Sometimes it does take a little while to find a good view, and same with Google Maps when you're dropping a pin, but I found that really useful and it really did expand my horizons a bit because it took me to places I wouldn't have ever thought of, and it's perfect for landscape references. My next suggestion is to paint from real life and do plein air drawing. This was really useful for me because, again, if you do find the amount of choice overwhelming, if you're just drawing something from your real life, it again narrows down the options. But it's also really good for like urban sketching and really getting out of your comfort zone, so you can just grab your sketchbook and draw what you see. And not only is that good for finding a subject, but it also changes the way you work, and so as an artist I think that's just a good thing to try in general. My next one is old books and magazines. So I've got quite a few books up there that I use for references, including some old National Geographic magazines which I picked up from a car boot sale. But I really enjoy looking through those, especially like the illustrated nature books. They always have some really lovely images in there to reference from, and they're perfect for sketchbook work. Another place you can find good references is actually from your own photos. So I definitely recommend looking back on past holidays and trips, and also asking friends and family when they go away to send you their photos. There's always some really lovely views. Obviously people take more photos when they're on holiday, and so if you're unable to travel you can live vicariously through others, and I do find that really helpful to be given some photos and drawing from them, especially because again you could be searching for ages on the internet not really knowing what you want, whereas being sent some photos from friends and family really helps narrow it down, and there's always some really nice photos to draw from there. Onto the last section, which is results. I'm going to be sharing the numbers and stats for my Instagram and how my audience grew, but I'm also going to be talking about how I've grown creatively and why I found it such a great thing to do. I realised at this point that the camera was back, so it's going to go back to past Katie to finish off this video. So last but not least, I want to share the results I found from doing my daily art challenge. From a creative point, it's definitely the best thing that I've ever done. I became a full-time artist in May 2021, and I started the daily art challenge in August. Like I said at the beginning, I could set time aside for creating because even though I had more time to create, I wasn't prioritising it. So having the accountability and knowing I was doing a daily art challenge was really good. It built a full portfolio for me that I can just scroll back through, and I've got full sketchbooks which I'm very proud of, and created a huge amount of work that really helps to find my style. So I definitely found what I like to draw, and I also discovered how I like to draw it. So I do feel like creating that much really helped me define my style, and I feel so much more confident with my artwork than I did a year ago. I really recommend daily art challenges for building your confidence with art and finding a style, because the more you create, obviously, the more you're experimenting, the more you're trying different things. Again, with like changing materials and mediums and sizes, it makes you change the way that you create. So the more you do, then the better you are at it. I'm a huge believer that creating artwork and becoming a better artist is just practice. And obviously, if I hadn't done this daily art challenge, I might have created once a week, whereas creating once a day is just sped up that process. So instead of taking me years and years to find my style, I kind of just sped up the process and did it all in 1 year instead. But I do think that that was a really good thing, and I feel in a much more confident place to continue creating. I haven't moved on to a new challenge. I wanted to take a break, but creating daily is still something that I want to create as a habit. I'm just not going to be showing it online every day anymore, but I found it really good for my mental health, and creating now feels like something that I can't not do. It's still something I want to make time for, even if I don't have the accountability of sharing online. So the daily art challenge has definitely grown my audience, and it's a lot bigger than when I started. I started the challenge on the 8th of August 2021 on 2,884 followers, and as of 1 year later, on the 8th of August 2022, I was on 19,660. So that was such a huge growth and not something I expected. I had hoped at the beginning that I might hit 10k after this whole year, and on the 11th of August, so just a few days later, I hit 20,000 on Instagram. So I was absolutely over the moon at that. I grew a much bigger community than I'd expected, but it really does feel like that. It feels like a community of friends. It's lovely to have comments and people being so invested in your daily art challenge and feeling inspired by what you create. It's such a lovely feeling sharing my artwork and hearing nice compliments. Instagram, like I said, when you're sharing things that you don't love, is a great way to find the good points on it. And so I really am a huge advocate for sharing your work online. So for me, it was a very positive challenge. I learned a lot about myself and my creativity, as well as growing my online platform to open up more opportunities for me as a full-time artist and having more opportunities for my career. So I hope this video has been useful if you've been thinking about doing a daily art challenge. It's definitely one of the best things that I've done, and I recommend it to everyone, especially if you make it work for you. If you have any questions or want to know anything else in more detail, then please do pop it in the comments down below, because I'll be happy to help you out. And let me know if you are planning on doing your own daily art challenge, or if you're in the middle of one and want to share it with the people who watch my videos, then do pop your links down below in the comments as well. I'd love to see what you're creating. Hopefully this video has added a boost of motivation for you as well. But I hope this video has been interesting, and I will see you next Sunday with another one. Have a good week. I'll see you later.